Welcome back, you hear Goldberg. Today we have to talk about an issue of immense importance. That is the propensity for conservatives and many libertarians to devalue, if not indirectly destroy, the very cultural foundations and traditions that they purport to be defending against the onslaught of the plural left on the one hand, or Islam. This is a phenomenon that becomes very visible whenever there's a discussion over career possibilities. And I understand the cost-benefit analysis argument, university is expensive, but these folks will take it to this knee-jerk, cult-like, ridiculous position where you really have to question, what's going on? So if a person expresses interest in studying art or sculpture or music, what is the number one retort from this crowd?
No, you should be doing stemtrades.
It's like, that's fine, those are valid options, but ostensibly, if a person's not motivated by this narcissistic individualism, we just need lower taxes, we need to be materialistic so we can all become Amazon cells, it's seen as inferior to these types, which has never quite made sense to me. And then leaving aside actually paying for education, let's say you're just really good at painting, you've been practicing, and you paint something for ethical or religious reasons, you're not planning to monetize it, they will say, oh, that's a waste of time. Or even if you are in STEM and you develop an app that is free, it's not really, you're not attempting to monetize, it's like a sort of, a public utility of sorts. Oh, it's a waste of time. Everything is about making money, otherwise you're somehow not quite succeeding at life. And if you stop for a second, which I think it's kind of important, creativity, inspiration, whatnot, look at a lot of examples in history. Mount Rushmore, the Eiffel Tower, Hagia Sophia. In this case, it's the Sistine Chapel. Yes, it's true that these guys at some level were getting paid, but the process of developing a talent, like obviously Michelangelo had some inherent talents, but he had to develop that. And if he had had people around him like these conservatives and libertarians, it would be, oh, well, don't do that. Why don't you go into something more practical? Why don't you just be a merchant or try to work for the governing state at the time? You don't encourage creativity, you're not going to have this great culture. This is what if you had Muslims trying to, we're going to destroy the Sistine Chapel, obviously a lot of conservatives would be riled up. But at the same time, they don't seem really interested in encouraging people to, pursue the various forms that would contribute to this Western civilization, this, cultural tapestry or inheritance that we're supposed to defend and safeguard. And it's just kind of odd, honestly. So when we come to the question of academics, this becomes exceptionally more visible. And I kind of wonder if it's not a consequence of sort of a class difference. So if you're rich in this country, you know how the system functions, you know how to use it. If you aren't rich, but you at least have an appreciation, you'll understand, okay, we have to do certain things, whether it's professionally, academically, if we want to be part of a certain group, if we want to enter the elite, the meritocratic circles, that's going to be required. But if you don't have the means or you just don't have the knowledge or appreciation for it, there's a tendency to just reject all of that in favor of this kind of, practical understanding of the world. I remember some chick saying, oh, she had street smarts and I was book smart. Well, it turned out I was actually more street smart than she. But you will see this mentality. And it often is a defense mechanism against not really knowing or understanding or, again, having means to pursue something. So if an individual says they want to get a PhD in sociology or history, they want to be an academic, maybe work for a think tank, what are you likely to hear from these groups? Why don't you just read a bunch of books? Look, I'm a big advocate of reading. It's absolutely important. You're probably going to learn more from reading than being in a university. But here's a question. If you take all your books that you've supposedly read and you erect a YouTube channel and you do your rants, that's fine. Now, unless your quality of videos as far as research and delivery and citations is at such a high standard, because hate to say this, I've noticed a lot of Manispherians or even conservative types that write books, and you can tell the ones that are educated and the ones that are not, because the ones that don't really have that background, they don't know how to cite sources. They'll just mention stuff without giving you any indication of where they got it from. And there's a lot of usually grammatical and spelling errors. This is the consequence of someone who doesn't really know how to review their own work, or at least pay someone else to do it for them. But let's say you take all those books you've read, and you take your YouTube channel, and you go to Heritage Foundation or AEI, Cato Institute, and you say, hey, I want a job as a research associate. The likelihood is they're not going to hire you unless, again, your videos are at that really high caliber, because they don't know if you actually absorbed anything. You can skim 100 books. You might not understand the point. Oh yeah, I've read a lot. Okay. And that's why a degree, for lack of better words, is an imperfect, however useful metric of saying, okay, we can kind of gauge whether this person can absorb a certain amount of information and can produce their own work, do independent study. They're not just reading something and then mouthing off on the internet. So that's where you have the contrast. There are certain professions you're not going to get into if you don't have a certain level of education. And just ranting and dismissing it because, well, I'm not doing that myself or you're not capable of doing it, I don't think it's very helpful, because it actually contributes to the decline of civilization ultimately. And if we just stop for a second, consider some figures. Victor Davis Hanson would be one. This is C.S. Lewis, very popular in right-wing circles. What's interesting is that C.S. Lewis, because they'll probably claim, well, back in the day, the universities were more conservative. They always have an excuse. It's either that it was back in the day it was more conservative, or today we have the gynocracy. There's always some excuse for why things can't be done. That's what I've noticed with these conservative and libertarian types. But C.S. Lewis was actually denied tenure at Oxford, where he had actually studied, probably because of his religious views. He did get a position at Cambridge, but his specialty was, I think, 16th century English, and he wrote a couple books on that. 16th century English would be scoffed at as a focus by most of these modern right-wing people. But of course, that's like one of the core essences of Western civilization. Your language, the history of it, defending it, and expanding appreciation for it. They just don't really get it because, it doesn't pay a ton of money, therefore it's a waste of time. That's the idea. And then we got our friend here. Obviously, he very quickly became this internet celebrity, darling of the right wing, even though he's not right wing himself per se, and his political suggestions and views are pretty cringe, to be honest. But nevertheless, the fact that Jordan Peterson has a PhD and was a professor, I believe, University of Toronto, gives him a certain level of credibility that some YouTube content creator ranting person does not have. Okay? It's the reason why, he's our guy, he's our professor, he's not a liberal, or at least not in the leftist sense, he's a classical liberal. So that helps. If Jordan Peterson had not gone to all that program, done his research, and he just decided to read some Carl Jung books, he wouldn't be looked at in the same way. Sure, maybe he'd have a YouTube channel, and he would become famous in the sense of Sargon of Akkad, or Stephen Chowder, or perhaps Joel Wosef Potson, but he's not going to be Dr. Jordan Peterson. So sometimes the structure, even though it is corrupt, even though it is filled with a lot of, garbage as far as cultural stuff and politics, the academic system, there's a certain benefit to it as far as you being able to influence others and potentially help the next generation. Now, this has to be given further appreciation because you ask the question of why is, especially academia, you can look at other instances, but why is academia faring so poorly? Now, they'll say, it's because they're all liberals or whatever. Well, starting in 2000, that's when the World War II generation began retiring, and that's when a lot of academia became more leftist in nature. It used to be a little bit more split, but now, of course, it's almost all one way. And they'll say, that's just because it's useless and only these losers go into it. But in fact, if you look at the history, in the 1970s, you had the economic crisis in the United States, and many universities stopped putting as much money into faculty. In many respects, they were following the corporate model, which ever since the 70s, but especially the 80s and 90s, instead of putting a lot of the money and resources into employees and middle managers, it was like, no, let's cut as many costs as possible. Let's enrich the top, the executives. In the case of university, it's the administration. They get all this money and endowment. They raise their own salaries. They build these structures for donors, but they don't really make any attempt to reduce tuition or actually help the faculty. And so what happened is that they went for the efficient business, Lean Six Sigma, management consultancy. You don't need full-time employees. So the universities started replacing full-timers with these adjuncts. Adjuncts are people who basically, similar to a 1099, you've got no benefits. You are paid on a, as needed, or based upon how many classes you do, you're paid per class. So many of them were just making slave wages. There was a case of a lady who she died of cancer and she had no money whatsoever, no insurance from the university. And what happens is, and you don't really hear about this, of course, these are not people who are just, they're idiots. When you go through a PhD program, you have to think. When you combine the amount of reading, the writing they're doing for their own classes, assisting professors with research, running discussion sections, doing the grading for those, it's a lot of work. So even if your program is being subsidized by the university in part, it's coming to something like basically less than minimum wage that you're actually making with all the time being put in. So it's not like these are lazy people who just want a free ride. They're doing a lot of work, but then they're being subjected to this graduating market where there's very few jobs, not necessarily because that's just how it has to be, but because of structures which have come down. And these, again, are largely conservative and libertarian ideas. Make it as cheap as possible to run, have the lowest cost staff, and then just focus the money on the top, on the people who are profiting off of the system. So I think it's something like 76% of professors have no job security, and really just brutal. Not just that, the publishing system, because you have to publish if you want to have credibility and potentially get a job. It works like this. They publish and then it's put behind a paywall. Something like JSTOR is a very popular one. That's a private corporation that has this agreement where they can basically prevent you from publishing more work. You have to pay sometimes ridiculous prices like $3,000 to access your own work. And the guy, I think his name was Aaron Swartz, he tried to release all these documents in a hacking attempt because he said, the information should be free. And he ended up being prosecuted. He committed suicide in prison. At least that's the official story. So you see how much this serves the economic system. And yet people are saying, that's just because it's a useless career. No, it's because it's been structured in such a manner to where even as a person with a PhD, you're going to be treated like a wage slave. This is the consequence of a much larger economic system, which in the past, conservatives and libertarians have shilled for. Now they're saying, you see, it's just because of liberals. And so with that type of model, the people who will end up doing academia are going to be typically the liberal elites, which is why your academic system is preaching just leftism. You have all this woke culture. So things have consequences, in other words. If they did some university reform and said the money has to go to the faculty, more jobs, you might actually have more conservative or libertarian-leaning academics. But again, there's no desire from these people to actually look at the root cause. They just want to sit there smugly, it's all screwed up, haha, it's because they're leftists. That is low IQ and frankly repugnant. Let's bear in mind, by the way, that this is starting to creep into the model, I should say, into STEM and trades, which they always try to uplift. So if you look at the unemployment rates, like in IT, computer science, they're a lot higher than one would expect given all the propaganda. And of course, with the visa system, the cheap labor, I think they just passed a giveaway in December. I don't know if the president has signed it, but the point being, they just want to bring in more of this cheap labor. They can undercut the graduates here. So even if you come out with a certain amount of debt, you are going to have not the best options as far as how much money you can make. And with trades as well, with the illegal immigrants, they're saying, we're not going to actually put you through to trade school. We'll make you a helper so we can pay you like $13, $14 an hour. We can get basically undercut these union laborers who actually know what they're doing and give people decent wages. This is something we're seeing across the board. It's coordinated. It's meant to turn most of people in this country, in the West in general, into these wage slaves. And then it'll be like, oh, well, the way you can become successful is TikTok. That's how you'll rise above the machine, so to speak. Oh, look at this girl. She's learned her trade well. She knows how to move her butt. Damn, she can shake that ass. And then she'll marry a millionaire. That'll be the way that you can actually not have to be a wage slave anymore, is to go on TikTok or maybe OnlyFans. So it is coordinated, it is planned, and the people who claim to be defending the civilization, defending the old ways, are basically contributing to its destruction. If you believe in Western civilization and culture, you have to at a certain point accept it's not just defending what's already there, but it's encouraging renewal, and it's also telling people, we want you in these fields. We want you producing art that's not just, okay, what passes for modern art. We want people who are into the language and into the culture and into, teaching the next generation why to value these things. You're not getting that if you just obsess, oh, let's all be materialistic, focused on the dollar alone or the Bitcoin or the gold, because that will simply lead to degeneracy and decay. And you often have to wonder, if these folks ran the entire system, would we not be living in these small little tenement houses built as cheaply as possible? And, maybe the rich would have some nice art in their life, but everything else would be boring because, well, we can't waste time on that. It's not cost effective. I'm just saying, you see it in the way houses are built today. I've done blog posts on this. The houses are nasty. They are not resilient. They don't last long. And it's the same thing. Let's make it cheap by cutting corners. So anyway, if you want to defend civilization, civilization includes more than just money and low taxes and individualistic narcissism. That's the short of it.